The student in the third row had come for extra credit. She was 21 years old, studying psychology, and she had expected to sit through an hour, look at her phone, and leave without remembering much of what had been said. Instead, she remained still inside the Aula Magna of Sapienza University of Rome, surrounded by more than 1,000 students, professors, administrators, and journalists. Then Pope Leo XIV looked across the hall and told them that they were not algorithms. The words reached her before she could prepare for them. She began to cry openly, not because the Pope had spoken about religion, doctrine, or the authority of the Catholic Church, but because he had named the pressure that had followed her through classrooms, screens, therapy sessions, and every silent comparison with people who seemed to be doing better. On May 14th, inside one of Europe's oldest academic halls, Pope Leo XIV declared that an entire generation had been taught to measure human worth through productivity, performance, and constant optimization. He called it the Great Lie, and he said it was destroying them. The visit carried a history that no one inside the Aula Magna could ignore. In 2008, Pope Benedict XVI had been scheduled to enter Sapienza University of Rome, but the appearance was cancelled after professors and students protested a speech they believed was hostile to scientific inquiry. The cancellation became more than a disrupted event. It was remembered inside the Vatican as a public humiliation and inside the university as a declaration that the Bishop of Rome did not belong there. For 18 years, the distance remained in place. No pope crossed the university threshold, and the absence hardened into a symbol of mistrust between one of Europe's most important public universities and the Catholic Church. By the time Pope Leo XIV considered returning, he was not approaching an ordinary lecture invitation. He was approaching a door that had been closed by conflict and left untouched for nearly 2 decades. Pope Leo XIV did not attempt to force the university into receiving him. He did not demand an invitation, send Vatican diplomats to negotiate terms, or use the public authority of his office to pressure the administration. Instead, he wrote directly to Antonella Polomeni, the rector of Sapienza University of Rome and a professor of dentistry, who had led the institution since 2020. The letter was personal, restrained, and carefully framed around the identity of the university itself. He expressed admiration for Sapienza's tradition of intellectual inquiry and respect for its secular character. He did not present himself as a religious authority arriving to instruct an unwilling audience. He described himself as a man who had spent his life teaching and who believed that the university remained one of the few places in the modern world where truth could still be pursued for its own sake. The approach changed the terms of the encounter before any decision had been made. The rector brought the letter into the university's internal process. It was discussed during a faculty meeting, where the memory of the cancelled visit in 2008 returned immediately. Some professors saw the letter as an opportunity to reopen a relationship that had remained frozen for 18 years. Others believed that allowing the Pope to speak inside a public university risked weakening the institution's secular independence. The opposition did not remain private. A small group of professors from the physics department circulated a petition against the visit, deliberately echoing the objections that had stopped Pope Benedict XVI from entering the university. The petition forced the administration to confront the same institutional fault line that had divided Sapienza nearly 2 decades earlier. The question was no longer only whether Pope Leo should be allowed to speak, but whether the university was prepared to repeat the decision that had defined its relationship with the Vatican since 2008. Antonella Polomeni made the final decision. She overruled the objections and authorized the invitation, accepting the Pope's request to address the students without changing the university's secular identity. No public reconciliation ceremony was announced, and no attempt was made to erase the previous conflict. The door was reopened through an administrative decision, a formal invitation, and the willingness of both sides to enter the same room without pretending that the history between them had disappeared. On the morning of May 14th, the university gates opened to a papal convoy unlike the ones normally associated with a formal visit. There were only 3 cars, moving without the ceremonial display, heavy security, theater, or public spectacle that often surrounds the arrival of a pope. The restraint was deliberate. Pope Leo XIV was entering Sapienza University of Rome as a teacher arriving to address students, not as a head of state demanding recognition. The convoy crossed the Città Universitaria, the campus designed by Marcello Piacentini and inaugurated in 1935. Students and university staff watched from the edges of the route as the vehicles moved toward the Ola Magna. There was no extended procession and no attempt to turn the arrival into a public performance. The simplicity of the movement reinforced the message already contained in the Pope's letter to the rector. At 10:15 in the morning, Pope Leo entered the Aula Magna. The timing had been fixed, the audience was already seated, and the tension created by the earlier opposition had not disappeared. Professors who supported the visit were waiting beside colleagues who had questioned it, while students filled the lower rows and the balcony above. After 18 years of symbolic distance, the Bishop of Rome had crossed the threshold of Sapienza University again. The Aula Magna was built to make every speaker feel the weight of the institution before saying a word. Marble floors stretched beneath tiered seating for more than 1,500 people, while Mario Cironi's enormous fresco filled the wall behind the stage with figures representing Italy, knowledge, science, law, and art. Since its inauguration in 1935, the hall had received presidents, scholars, Nobel laureates, heads of state, and generations of academics. On that morning, every part of the room reminded the audience that Sapienza was not surrendering its identity by receiving the Pope. Approximately 1,200 people had gathered before he entered. Students had arrived early to secure seats. Professors had canceled classes, and university staff stood beside administrators and members of the faculty senate. Journalists from major Italian newspapers occupied the rear rows, joined by representatives from 3 international wire services. A small group of Vatican officials had also come to observe, including 2 members of the Dicastery for Culture and Education. The audience was not composed of pilgrims waiting for a blessing. Many were secular, some were openly atheist, and most had been trained to question authority, test claims, and resist emotional persuasion. The professors who had supported the visit sat in the same hall as those who had opposed it, while graduate students stood in the balcony after the seats below had filled. Curiosity was present, but so was the skepticism of people who expected evidence before conviction. Pope Leo XIV walked toward the lectern slowly. He wore the white papal cassock, the white zucchetto, and the simple pectoral cross he had continued to wear since his election, reportedly the same cross he had worn as Bishop of Chiclayo. He carried no binder, folder, or written pages. The entire 47-minute speech had been memorized. He reached the lectern and did not begin immediately. His eyes moved across the lower rows, then toward the balcony where students were standing. He looked at the professors, the staff, the administrators, and the journalists without favoring any part of the hall. The room waited as the Pope took one breath and prepared to address an audience that had given him no promise of agreement. Pope Leo XIV stood at the lectern for a moment without speaking. He offered no ceremonial greeting, no acknowledgement of dignitaries, and no opening pleasantry to soften the room. He looked directly at the audience and said that he wanted to speak about a lie. It was not a political lie or a religious lie, but a lie about what they were. The hall became still. He described a system that reached them through every screen they touched and every metric used to measure them. It told them that they were numbers, that their worth depended on productivity, and that their value could be calculated through performance. It trained them to compete, optimize, and prove that they deserved to remain visible. He did not exaggerate the system into a single villain. He said he was speaking carefully because the structure was complex, but the effect was clear. Young people were being taught that failure made them dispensable, and that falling behind meant they had become less valuable. The pressure did not remain inside universities or workplaces. It entered private thought and changed the way they judged themselves. Then he paused and looked toward the students in the front rows. The room was no longer observing a visiting head of the Catholic Church from a safe academic distance. The Pope had named the logic that followed them from classrooms to phones and from examinations to job applications. He called it the Great Lie, and he said it was destroying them. A professor of sociology seated in the faculty section later said that the atmosphere changed at that exact moment. The audience drew breath together, not because the statement was unfamiliar, but because it had been spoken with a clarity they had not expected. Students who had entered prepared to resist religious authority heard their own daily experience described from the lectern. The confrontation had begun, and the Pope had placed the system itself on trial. Pope Leo XIV moved from accusation to evidence. He described what he called the spiritual malaise of the current generation, but he was careful not to present it as a diagnosis that required religious belief. He called it a human crisis, visible in public data, university counseling offices, hospital records, and the daily lives of students who could no longer separate pressure from identity. Faith was not necessary to recognize the damage, and religion was not necessary to grieve it. He began with Europe. Depression among university-aged adults had risen by 40% during the previous decade, while anxiety disorders had doubled. The number of students seeking psychological counseling on European campuses had tripled since 2015. In Italy alone, 1 in 3 university students reported symptoms of clinical anxiety severe enough to interfere with study, sleep, relationships, and ordinary functioning. Then he turned to the United States, the country where he had been born and educated. The National Surgeon General had declared youth mental health a crisis, and suicide had become the second leading cause of death among Americans between the ages of 15 and 24. Emergency room visits for self-harm among teenage girls had increased by 60% since 2010. The generation expected to be the most connected in human history had become, by measurable standards, the loneliest. He delivered the figures without raising his voice. There was no theatrical anger and no attempt to turn suffering into spectacle. His tone remained controlled, like a teacher presenting evidence that could not be dismissed because it made the audience uncomfortable. Then he separated the students from the accusation hidden inside the statistics. These were not numbers describing weak people. They described a system that produced anxiety, whether by deliberate design or by consequences. No one had been willing to stop. It measured everything while valuing nothing, and it told young people that they were what they achieved before making achievement unreachable for many and empty for those who attained it. The failure was not located only inside the individual. Pope Leo allowed the silence to remain for 3 seconds. No one moved to fill it because the figures had already established the scale of the crisis and his conclusion had changed who stood accused. The students were not being asked why they could not endure the system. The system was being asked what it had done to them. Pope Leo XIV began with the screens the students touched every day. Social media platforms, he said, were not neutral spaces that happened to produce insecurity as an unintended effect. Their systems were engineered to amplify comparison, envy, anxiety, and self-doubt, because those emotions kept people watching, scrolling, and returning. Engagement produced revenue, and the pain of the user became part of the business model. He made the structure explicit. The students were not the customers. They were the product. Their attention was being sold, and their insecurity was being monetized by systems that had no financial incentive to make them whole. The language was direct because the mechanism was already familiar to everyone in the room. What many had experienced as private weakness was being exposed as a profitable design. He then turned toward the academic institutions surrounding them. Human potential, he said, had been reduced to grade point averages, standardized examinations, publication records, and ranking systems that trained students to measure themselves against one another. They were taught not to grow together, but to outperform, and not simply to learn, but to prove superiority. The promised result was excellence, but the lived result was exhaustion. The same logic followed them beyond the university. Labor markets offered temporary contracts, unpaid internships, and unstable work presented as flexibility while removing the security required to build a future. Young people were expected to adapt endlessly to systems that refused to make long-term commitments to them. A generation unable to plan its future was being told in practical terms that its future did not matter. Meritocracy completed the pressure by turning structural failure into personal guilt. The culture promised that talent and effort would always produce success, then blamed individuals when economic and political barriers made that success impossible. If they were anxious, they were told they had not tried hard enough. If they were depressed, they were told they were not strong enough. And if they fell behind, they were told they were not good enough. Pope Leo called that logic abuse. He named it the blackmail of expectations and the pressure to perform, phrases that students later said described their daily lives with devastating accuracy. A 24-year-old doctoral student in engineering told an Italian newspaper that he had never heard any authority figure, religious or otherwise, describe his experience so precisely. The Pope was not speaking in abstractions, and the audience knew it. Pope Leo XIV then moved beneath the systems he had described and addressed the deeper claims supporting them. The lie was not only that young people had to perform, the lie was that performance could reveal what a human being was. If a person could be reduced to matter, biology, and predictable neural activity, then every part of life could eventually be measured, ranked, and optimized. He described the human being as the modern system increasingly preferred to describe it, a pattern of inputs and outputs, a collection of data points, a mechanism that could be understood if enough information were gathered. Under that model, desire became chemical activity, thought became computation, and identity became something that institutions and platforms could calculate. The person disappeared behind the model built to explain the person. Pope Leo slowly shook his head. He told the students that they were not algorithms. They were desire itself, an aching and persistent movement toward meaning, love, truth, and something no metric could measure and no platform could deliver. Their deepest longings were not errors in a system waiting to be corrected. He told them they were not the sum of what they owned, produced, or achieved. They were not matter assembled without purpose inside a silent universe. They were questions that the universe could not answer on its own, and the fact that they were alive, aware, and searching was not an accident to be optimized away. It was a gift. The declaration struck the hall with more force than anything that had come before it. Students who had been leaning back moved forward in their seats, while professors who had been writing stopped and looked up from their notes. The skepticism visible when the Pope entered began to disappear. In its place came a form of attention that could not be performed for anyone else. Several students raised their phones and began recording. They were not yet trying to create a public moment, but to preserve one they feared they might not hear again with the same clarity. The 21-year-old psychology student in the third row was already crying. For the first time that morning, the great lie had been answered, not with another demand, but with a different account of what she was. Within hours, the sentence had escaped, the Ola Magna, a student's 22-second recording of Pope Leo XIV saying that a human being was a desire rather than an algorithm, spread first across Italy, then beyond it. The clip accumulated more than 3 million views within 48 hours, and within 2 days, the line had been translated into dozens of languages. What had begun as a sentence inside a lecture hall had become a public claim about human identity. The phrase moved quickly into physical spaces. A design student in Florence printed it on shirts that began selling online within 72 hours. Students carried it on protest signs during a demonstration against tuition increases in Milan. At the University of Bologna, someone wrote it in black marker on the wall of a dormitory bathroom, and no one removed it. The line became one of the most widely quoted papal statements in recent memory. Pope Francis had once asked a question that invited interpretation, but Pope Leo had made a declaration that allowed no ambiguity. A human being was not an algorithm. The certainty of the statement was precisely what made it spread. Then Pope Leo shifted the argument from the life of the individual to the machinery of civilization. Even Vatican officials who had received an outline of the address had not been briefed on the full scope of what followed. He began speaking about artificial intelligence with a level of technical specificity that the audience had not expected from a religious leader. The language was not vague, fearful, or hostile to technology itself. He distinguished between artificial intelligence used as a tool and artificial intelligence used as a substitute for moral judgment. He acknowledged its potential value in medicine, education, scientific research, and accessibility. The danger began when systems were given authority in areas where responsibility could not be transferred without consequence. A machine could assist a human decision, but it could not carry the moral burden of that decision. He named the domains directly. Algorithms were already influencing creditworthiness, hiring decisions, prison sentences, and facial recognition systems deployed against minority communities. He warned about the concentration of artificial intelligence development inside a small number of corporations whose financial interests did not necessarily serve the common good. The same institutions that gathered data about human behavior were being trusted to define human value. The sharpest warning concerned autonomous weapons. Pope Leo said that military systems must never be allowed to remove human responsibility from the decision to kill or deepen the tragedy of war. A drone could not grieve, a targeting system could not hesitate, and a machine could not understand the life it destroyed. Delegating lethal judgment to a system without conscience was not efficiency. It was the abandonment of conscience. The connection to the earlier argument was deliberate. The logic that reduced a student to a grade point average could also reduce a person to a target on a screen. The structure that measured worth through productivity could teach a government to calculate whether a life cost more or less than a weapon. The great lie was no longer confined to a classroom or a social media platform. It had become civilizational. Pope Leo XIV turned from autonomous weapons to the political choices surrounding them. He spoke about the military buildup taking place across Europe without naming individual governments. The meaning was clear to anyone following the direction of continental policy. Rearmament was no longer an abstract possibility, but a budgetary decision already reshaping public priorities. He cited global military spending that had risen beyond $3 trillion in 2025, according to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. Several European nations, he said, had increased their military budgets by between 20 and 40% in only 2 years. During the same period, funding for universities, mental health services, and youth employment programs had been reduced. The contrast placed two different visions of the future on the same ledger. He warned the audience not to confuse rearmament with defense simply because governments used the language of security. A continent that spent more on weapons while withdrawing support from its young people had already made a choice about what it believed deserved protection. That choice would not remain confined to ministries or parliamentary votes. The students sitting before him would inherit its consequences. Pope Leo looked directly at them as he spoke. He did not turn toward the professors, the university leadership, or the journalists waiting to report his words. The young people in the hall would live with the reduced classrooms, delayed employment, weakened health services, and political instability created by those decisions. The future being discussed belonged to them, but the power to shape it remained elsewhere. He then addressed the logic of war itself. Conflict did not begin only when weapons were fired, because the categories that made violence possible entered public life long before the first attack. The division between friend and enemy, the instinct to treat the other as a threat, and the demand that every disagreement produce a victor and a defeated opponent could spread from international politics into ordinary human relationships. Once that logic became normal, reason itself became contaminated. The students understood that he was speaking about more than military conflict. Political polarization, online hostility, and cultural battles had transformed disagreement into combat and opponents into enemies. Social media rewarded the fastest accusation, while public debate punished hesitation, complexity, and correction. The same systems that profited from personal insecurity also profited from collective anger. The Pope placed a particular responsibility on the university. Simplification, he said, had to be corrected through care for complexity and the wise exercise of memory. A university could not become another institution that trained people to repeat slogans, defend camps, or produce knowledge only for commercial advantage. It had to remain a place where truth was pursued because truth itself mattered. He praised Sapienza University of Rome for its centuries of intellectual courage. He invoked its founding spirit, wisdom, building her own house, and told the audience that the House of Wisdom had to remain open to every serious question. Scientific inquiry could explain mechanisms, measure outcomes, and expand human capability. It could not by itself answer why human life possessed meaning or what one person owed another. The questions that remained were not evidence of intellectual failure. They concerned love, death, purpose, responsibility, and the reason human beings continued searching even after material needs had been satisfied. Pope Leo did not ask the university to abandon rigor for belief. He asked it to recognize that knowledge became dangerous when separated from wisdom. He told the students that knowledge without wisdom could become a weapon. Wisdom without compassion could become a cage, protecting those who possessed it while excluding those who needed it. He asked them to be rigorous without becoming cruel, brilliant without becoming arrogant, and wise without withdrawing from the suffering around them. Expertise alone would not repair the world being handed to them. The hall remained silent as the speech approached its conclusion. The Pope had begun with the private anxiety of a student and moved outward through academic pressure, labor insecurity, technology, automated judgment, warfare, public spending, and the purpose of the university itself. Each subject had been held together by the same question. Would human beings be treated as persons, or as units inside systems built to measure and use them? Then Pope Leo XIV gave the audience one final command. It was not offered as a polite suggestion or softened into pastoral encouragement. He told them to become a radical yes to life. The words remained in the hall for a moment before the audience answered. The hall rose before Pope Leo XIV had fully stepped away from the lectern. Students, professors, administrators, journalists, and even the physics professors who had opposed the visit stood in sustained applause for nearly 2 minutes. When the Pope raised one hand, the sound faded, and he looked across the Ola Magna with the gratitude of a teacher who knew the lesson had been received. He shook Rector Antonella Polomeni's hand and left without question, ceremony, or delay. The departure took less than 90 seconds, but the audience remained inside for another 20 minutes. Students gathered in small groups, replaying parts of the speech and trying to understand why it had affected them so deeply. In the courtyard, the psychology student from the third row told journalists that she had spent 2 years in therapy because she felt permanently behind and unable to perform well enough. That morning, she said, the Pope had told her that she was not a machine. The reaction spread far beyond Sapienza. Progressive commentators praised the address for confronting mental illness and human dignity without condescension, while conservative Catholics saw it as a clear defense of the human person as created in the image of God. Technology researchers and computer scientists challenged the distinction between human desire and algorithmic processes, arguing that the Pope had misunderstood how computation and the brain worked. The disagreement only expanded the speech into academic papers, editorials, classroom debates, and public arguments across Italy. Inside the Vatican, officials viewed the address as a statement of purpose. One advisor said the Pope had not gone to the university to convert anyone, but to speak a truth that no other authority had expressed with the same clarity. Another official, who had known him in Peru, said that people misunderstood Leo because they treated him as a politician. He was, above all, a teacher. Universities quickly began using the speech in courses on technology, ethics, psychology, and meritocracy. A professor at Sapienza wrote to colleagues that the Pope had delivered the most effective description of the social causes of anxiety she had heard. Her question was more uncomfortable than the praise. Why had it taken a religious leader to say what universities should have been saying for years? Pope Leo returned to the Vatican that afternoon and resumed his ordinary work. He ate alone, read reports from the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith, and made no public comment about the attention surrounding the speech. He did not ask how many people had watched the recording or how the newspapers had responded. That evening, however, he called his secretary back before the man left for the night. The Pope asked him to identify the young woman who had been crying in the third row. He instructed him to send her a rosary and a card bearing a brief message. She was not an algorithm. She was loved. The package reached her dormitory the following morning. She was not Catholic, had never been baptized, did not attend Mass, and had never spoken personally with a priest before that day. A friend later said that she held the rosary in silence and then wondered whether the church was different from what she had imagined. She kept it on her nightstand. The final legacy of May 14th was not a policy, a decree, or a headline. It was a student who no longer saw herself only as a failing machine, and a rosary beside her bed from a pope who had remembered her pain. What remained could not be measured by a platform, a ranking, or an algorithm. It was hope.